One thing that is clear from today's testimony is that the Ukrainians were under a tremendous amount of pressure from President Donald Trump to investigate his political rival, Joe Biden. And the Ukrainians were really wrestling with precisely what they were going to do about that pressure. There were a number of voices along the way who were telling the new Ukrainian president to steer clear of meddling in American elections. And that included Ambassador Bill Taylor and both Republican and Democratic members of the U.S. Senate. Ambassador Taylor talked about it in his opening statement today.
On September 5th, I accompanied Senators Johnson and Murphy during their visit to Kyiv. When we met with President Zelensky, his first question to the senators was about the withheld security assistance. My recollection of the meeting is that both senators stressed that bipartisan support for Ukraine in Washington was Ukraine's most important strategic asset, and that President Zelensky should not jeopardize that bipartisan support by getting drawn into U.S. domestic politics.
Joining me now is one of the senators who met with President Zelensky, Senator Chris Murphy, Democrat from Connecticut. Senator, I wanted to ask you about that meeting. I think we've talked a little bit about it before. It was interesting to hear it in the testimony. How well do you recall that meeting and what happened in it?
Well, I recall the meeting well. I recall it as Ambassador Taylor remembers it. Of course, back in the spring, Rudy Giuliani was openly crowing about his attempts to get the Ukrainian government, the new President Zelensky, to investigate the president's political rivals. And one of the reasons I wanted to go to Ukraine in early September was to raise this issue with Zelensky, to tell him that it was going to damage Ukraine's credibility if they were seen as an agent of the Trump campaign. And I also remember, as Ambassador Taylor does, that when we sat down at the meeting, Zelensky sort of dispensed with the regular diplomatic formalities. He wanted to get right to this question of how he could get the aid turned back on. This was an absolute priority to him because he knew that Ukrainian soldiers were dying on the front without that American aid. And in the end of the meeting, he did tell us that he had no intent to get involved in American politics. Little did we know that he was at the very moment involved in back-channel negotiations to do just that, because he was being told if he didn't announce investigations into Joe Biden, he wasn't getting that security aid.
So here's what's fascinating to me. That aid is held up, I believe, in mid-July. By that time, word had made its way to you and other people on the Hill, right, that the aid was held. Like, what do you know, as someone deeply invested in Ukrainian policy, about the reasons for this mysterious hold on the aid that had been voted through by both houses of Congress and signed by the president?
Right. So we don't learn about the withholding of the aid until only days before our trip to Ukraine in early September. And so the notice was very late to Congress. And of course, the president does not have the ability to withhold aid to a country once it's been congressionally appropriated. And if he does it, he's got to go through a long, burdensome process of notification, which the administration didn't do. Of course, we all suspected that it could be that the aid was being withheld as leverage. And even if that hadn't been explicitly told to the Ukrainians, as it was, of course, their impression would be that in order to get the money, they have to start acceding to the requests that the president's representatives are making. So to me, it looked corrupt on the face of it, which is part of the reason why I wanted to go to Ukraine. But now we know that it was not implied, that it was actually explicit. And we're going to have a number of people testify to that before the House Impeachment Committee.
You just highlighted something that I just wanted to follow up on, which Republicans today making an argument, the narrow version of which I think is true, which the president sets foreign policy priorities. But in this particular instance, I mean, even, Matt Gaetz saying the deep state is subverting the president's policy. I'm not crazy here. The House and the Senate passed this appropriation for this aid, and the president himself signed it, right? It was not magically called into law.
Right.
This was the policy of both Article 1 and Article 2 branches of the United States government.
Well, and what's interesting is that for the first year or so of the president's term, he often bragged about the fact that he had given more aid to the Ukrainians than President Obama did, until, of course, he figured out that he could use that aid as leverage to get help for himself politically. And so, yes, the president is able to dictate a lot of American foreign policy, but amongst the tools he has at his disposal is not the withholding of aid that Congress has appropriated appropriated. And he and his advisors know that because many of them recommended against him doing it because of its illegality.
The nature of kind of polarization being what it is, it was interesting to hear about this sort of bipartisan consensus in support of Ukraine as they are currently occupied by Russia. They've lost 13,000 service members in that war, which is a number I had not heard before and was quite shocking, actually. Do you fear that that's unraveling now as you watch Republicans on the committee who, out of a kind of tribal loyalty to the president, seem to also be turning on Ukraine?
Yeah, and listen, the reason that we are involved in Ukraine is because Russia has breached a very important international norm, which is the sanctity of borders. Now, Ukraine's not a NATO ally. We don't have an obligation to defend them. But if we telegraph that Ukraine is on their own, that there's going to be no consequence to Russia for invading that country, then it's an invitation to lots of other countries to start thinking about expanding their territory as well. And for a long time, Republicans and Democrats got that. So we stood together and we helped Ukraine. We certainly knew that there was corruption there, but we didn't attack Ukraine on a regular basis. We tried to help them get better. Now it's the president's strategy to try to combat the impeachment process to make Ukraine look as desperate and as weak and as dysfunctional as possible. And that, of course, delights Russia. And it frankly invites other countries to think about these same kind of incursions into peripheral territory because they might get away with it in the way that Russia seems to be getting away with it right now.
All right, Senator Chris Murphy, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.